Okay, so I left off with getting to meet Gibson for the first time in my last video, or I guess the video before my last video. Um, if you haven't watched it, watch it because at the end I include a really cute picture of me getting to see him for the first time through like a little window in the incubator thing. The next thing that I feel like is pretty significant in our story as like a it's kind of a sad one. I was in the hospital myself for 7 days, and at first I thought that we would be able to go home at the same time, because at this point we didn't have any other information other than we were trying to get him to eat more, or even be able to tolerate more going through his feeding tube. Unfortunately, I got discharged and Gibson had to stay in the hospital. This was honestly one of the most difficult things I think that I've had to do in my life, was to leave my brand new baby in the hospital and go home. At this point, I still needed a pretty good bit of help to walk, so I was Brian wheeled me down to the front doors of the hospital, and then he went back up and kind of gathered all of our stuff from the week of us staying there and brought that down, and then he went out to get the car and bring it up. So while he was upstairs collecting all of our stuff to bring down, and then also while he went out to get the car to bring it up, I sat in the wheelchair at the sliding glass doors of the hospital and watched a few, I don't know exactly how many, I didn't count. It felt like a lot, but it could have only just been a few. But I watched several families loading their brand new babies up in the car while I sat there empty-handed, waiting to go home without mine. The sadness that I felt in that moment was immeasurable, at least at the time. I didn't have anything to compare it to as far as devastation, but I held it together until Brian was helping me out of the wheelchair to get into our car, and he closed the door and I just burst into ugly cry kind of tears, sobbing, hysterically sobbing. I was kind of able to regain my composure, but then we got to our RV, because I mentioned, we were traveling in an RV, and my mom was still there, so she came down the night I had Gibson on a plane and stayed with our dogs by herself in our RV, because she wasn't allowed to come to the hospital. But by the time we got there, I don't want to say I sucked it up, because that's not right, but I had regained composure over myself, and as soon as my mom opened the door and I was standing in front of her, I just completely lost it all over again. And even though I knew I was going to be able to go back to see him in the morning, it still was I don't know. I remember my mom asking me are you okay? What's the matter? She thought something was wrong, physically, right? She thought something was wrong, with me. And I just remember crying, I had to leave him, and just sobbed. For 2 weeks after I was discharged, I wasn't allowed to drive because I was taking a lot of pain medication still. So my mom stayed for those 2 weeks and drove me back and forth to the hospital every single day. So I would go and she would drop me off, and I would sit in the hospital for like 6 hours, 8 hours, and then she would take me back home. She was kind of waiting, not only to help take care of me, but she was kind of waiting to see like when he was going to get to come home, because obviously she wanted to meet him. And at the end of that second week of her driving me back and forth, it had been a total of 3 weeks since she'd been down there and like been away from my dad and home and her own dogs and everything. And I just told her like she needed to go home, because at that point we didn't know when he was going to be able to leave. Once I was able to drive, she went home and Brian went back to work, just so he didn't use all of his paternity days or vacation days like before Gibson even came home. So what I did was every day I would get up and take care of the dogs. I'd go to the hospital and I would stay there for anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, sometimes 10 if it was a really stressful day. And then I would go home and take care of the dogs and make food or clean or shower. And Brian would leave work and go to the hospital and be there for like 2 hours. Sometimes, depends on what time he would get there or like what was going on that day. Sometimes longer, sometimes less. And we did that schedule for like total 37 days the first time. On the 37th day, we got to spend the night with Gibson, with kind of like a practice run of bringing him home, kind of to see how we would do overnight. And that was the first time that we got to be in the same room together as a family for 36 days. Like since that very first night, 2 o'clock in the morning, I guess not very first night, but when I got to meet him the first time, that was the first and only time we had been in the room together as a family. So we got to do that, and it was awful. Neither one of us slept, and after being there all night, it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, and I remember just like breaking down when my favorite NICU doctor came in to talk to us about kind of what was going on and what was going to happen from that point on. And I just remember crying and crying and crying because it was so terrible. I think it was a few days later, maybe a week, we got to do it again, and it went better. And I remember being kind of scared to bring him home because for, you know, the whole time he'd been alive at that point, he was under the care of a full medical staff 24 hours a day. And I almost felt like, how am I allowed to bring this fragile little thing home? Like, how am I allowed to do this? So it was after many, many, many tears and little achievements that felt like massive achievements that we were finally able to bring him home. And when we brought him home, he was only 5 pounds. So he was like 5 weeks old, maybe a little bit more, and he only weighed 5 pounds. And I'll stitch the video of us bringing him home.